When an avoidant starts acting distant and cold, most people make the same mistake. They assume detachment, they assume loss of interest, they assume the emotional connection is fading, but psychologically, that interpretation is almost always wrong. What you're witnessing is not emotional absence, it's emotional overload, and this distinction changes everything about how you understand their behavior. Avoidant individuals are not wired to process strong emotions externally. They don't move toward intensity, they move away from it. Intimacy doesn't register as comfort in their nervous system, it registers as threat, not because you did something wrong, but because closeness activates deep, often unconscious fears of dependency, loss of autonomy, or being emotionally exposed in ways they don't know how to manage. So when feelings intensify, distance becomes their coping mechanism. Here's the paradox that most people never grasp. The moment an avoidant feels more, they often show less. The emotional volume inside them goes up, but their external expression shuts down. Think of it like a circuit breaker. When the system is overloaded, it doesn't amplify, it cuts power. Coldness is not apathy, it's a psychological shutdown designed to prevent emotional overwhelm. This is why their distance often appears suddenly, without a clear external trigger. Nothing dramatic has to happen. Sometimes it's simply that the connection reached a level of meaning they weren't prepared to handle. A sense of emotional significance formed. And significance is dangerous to an avoidant mind because significance implies vulnerability. It implies that you matter. And if you matter, you can hurt them or require something from them they don't know how to give. So they pull back, not to detach from you, but to regulate themselves. And during that withdrawal, something important happens. While their body creates space, their mind becomes hyperactive. The physical distance creates psychological proximity. Without constant interaction to regulate their emotions, their thoughts begin to fill the gap. Conversations replay. Moments are analyzed. Subtle emotional cues are reinterpreted. The avoidant may look calm, indifferent, even dismissive on the surface, but internally, there is mental noise, a lot of it. This is where people misread the situation and sabotage themselves. They chase clarity, they demand reassurance, they push for emotional engagement. And from their perspective, that makes sense, but from the avoidance nervous system, that pressure increases the overload. It confirms the very fear they're trying to escape, that intimacy equals loss of control. Distance, then, becomes their way of restoring balance. It's not a strategy to forget you, it's an attempt to stabilize, while carrying feelings they don't fully understand. The irony is that the more they try to create emotional safety through distance, the more their unresolved feelings concentrate around you. You become the focal point, not because you're present, but because you're absent. This is also why avoidants often appear contradictory. They can be warm, curious, even deeply engaged one moment, and cold or unreachable the next. That inconsistency isn't manipulation. It's an internal tug of war between desire and fear. One part of them wants connection. Another part is terrified of what that connection represents. And here's the crucial insight. Emotional overload does not dissipate through avoidance. It accumulates. You can suppress awareness temporarily, but unresolved attachment doesn't disappear. It waits. It builds pressure, and pressure always seeks release. So when you see coldness, don't confuse it with emotional death. It's often the opposite. It's a sign that something inside them is alive, activated, and unresolved. The distance is not the end of the story, it's the pause before the internal reckoning. The real question isn't whether they care. The question is whether you will respond with emotional intelligence instead of emotional impulse. Because the way you handle this phase determines whether the connection collapses under pressure or transforms when avoidance stops working. And that's the reflection I want to leave you with. Sometimes the coldest behavior you experience isn't proof that you don't matter. It's proof that you matter more than they're ready to handle. When an avoidant goes silent, most people interpret that silence as peace. They assume the avoidant has moved on, shut down emotionally, or simply doesn't care enough to engage. But psychologically, silence is not the absence of thought. For the avoidant mind, silence is regulation. It's how they manage internal chaos without having to expose it. Avoidants don't calm themselves by expressing emotion. They calm themselves by withdrawing from stimulation. Conversation, especially emotionally charged conversation, increases arousal in their nervous system. It forces them to stay present with feelings they don't feel equipped to process in real time. So when emotional intensity rises, silence becomes their refuge. Not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much. What's rarely understood is that silence doesn't quiet their mind. It activates it. When external input stops, internal processing accelerates. The absence of communication removes distraction, and without distraction, the mind fills the space. Thoughts of you begin to surface not as comfort, but as unresolved data, unfinished conversations, emotional moments without closure, questions that have no easy answer. This is why avoidants often think about someone most intensely when there is no contact. Interaction allows them to stay in control. Silence removes that control. Without dialogue to manage impressions or regulate emotional distance, the mind turns inward. And inward is exactly where avoidants struggle the most, because it forces them to confront feelings they've spent years learning to suppress. There's also a deeper psychological mechanism at play here. The human mind fixates on what is incomplete. Unresolved emotional experiences demand attention until they are integrated. For an avoidant, silence creates incompleteness. There's no resolution, no emotional conclusion, no clear narrative. So the mind loops. It replays interactions, searches for meaning, tries to predict outcomes, and the more the avoidant tries not to think about you, the more persistent the thoughts become. This is where people misunderstand the avoidance withdrawal as emotional detachment. In reality, silence often marks the beginning of obsession, not obsession in a dramatic or romantic sense, but in a cognitive one. You become a recurring mental reference point, a question that hasn't been answered, a feeling that hasn't been categorized, and the mind does not like loose ends. What makes this especially powerful is that avoidants rely heavily on external structure to manage their internal state. Work, routines, distractions, independence, these are not just lifestyle choices, they are emotional regulation strategies. When silence disrupts the relational structure they're used to, it destabilizes their sense of equilibrium. Suddenly, the emotional balance they maintain through distance and control starts to wobble, and here's where emotional intelligence becomes critical. When you chase an avoidant during silence, you provide relief. You restore predictability. You give them something external to respond to instead of something internal to confront. But when you allow the silence to exist without reaction, you shift the burden of regulation back onto them. The discomfort doesn't disappear, it deepens. This isn't about punishment or manipulation, it's about understanding how the avoidant nervous system works. Silence forces introspection, and introspection forces awareness. Awareness is what avoidants fear, but it's also what they need in order to grow beyond avoidance. Over time, silence creates contrast. They feel the difference between your presence and your absence. They notice the emotional weight of that absence, and that awareness often arrives not as longing at first, but as unease. Something feels off. Something feels unresolved, and that discomfort keeps circling back to one source, you. So if you're interpreting silence as failure, reconsider. Silence is not nothing. It's pressure building in the background. It's the mind trying to resolve what the heart hasn't processed yet. And the reflection I'll leave you with is this. Silence doesn't erase emotional impact. It concentrates it. When you stop filling the space, you allow the truth to rise. And what rises often tells a story far more powerful than words ever could. There comes a moment in every avoidant dynamic when something subtle but profound shifts. It's not when you argue. It's not when you plead. It's not even when they pull away. It's when you stop filling the space they've been using to stay emotionally asleep. Your absence removes the noise, and in that silence, awareness begins. Avoidants are masters of distraction. Not in a careless way, but in a deeply functional one. They structure their lives around activity, independence, productivity, and self-reliance because motion keeps emotion at bay. As long as there's something to do, something to manage, something external to focus on, they don't have to sit with what they feel. Distraction becomes emotional anesthesia. When you were present, checking in, explaining, adjusting, reaching out, you were unknowingly part of that system. Your engagement gave them something to respond to instead of something to reflect on. But when you step back, that system collapses. The distractions lose their effectiveness. And what's left is emotional awareness they can no longer outsource or avoid. This is where avoidance stops working without your presence. To regulate the emotional temperature, the avoidance internal world becomes louder. Feelings they've been suppressing rise to the surface not as clarity, but as discomfort. There's a sense of imbalance. Something feels unresolved, and they can't immediately name why. They just know that something is missing, and that absence is connected to you. This forced awareness is deeply unsettling for an avoidant, Because awareness means acknowledgement. And acknowledgement threatens the core belief they've lived by, that they don't need anyone, that attachment is optional, that emotional dependence is weakness. Your absence challenges that belief without saying a word. Philosophically, this is the moment when avoidance meets reality. You can run from feelings, but you can't outrun the consequences of ignoring them. Emotion deferred doesn't disappear, it accumulates. And once the external stimuli are gone, the mind turns inward whether it wants to or not. This is why avoidants often experience a delayed emotional response. Not while you're present, but after you're gone. The nervous system finally has no choice but to process. Memories resurface, emotional moments gain new weight, and the connection they minimize begins to feel more significant in hindsight than it ever did in real time. What's important here is that this awareness is not comfortable. It doesn't feel romantic at first. It feels destabilizing. It else like a loss of equilibrium. And humans are wired to restore balance. The mind starts searching for resolution, for relief, for a way to return to emotional stability. And here's where people sabotage themselves. They rush back in the moment they sense distance. They reintroduce noise. They relieve the discomfort. They rescue the avoidant from awareness before it has a chance to do its work. But when you allow the absence to remain, you allow growth to begin. This isn't about withholding affection as a tactic. It's about respecting the psychological process that avoidance requires in order to break down. Awareness precedes change, and awareness cannot occur in the presence of constant emotional buffering. Your absence becomes a mirror. It reflects back what was taken for granted. It highlights the emotional space you once occupied, and it forces the avoidant to confront a truth they've been avoiding. That connection mattered more than they allowed themselves to admit. This is also the stage where emotional responsibility quietly shifts. They can no longer blame circumstances, timing, or your behavior for how they feel. The feeling exists on its own now, and that realization, this is coming from me, is both terrifying and transformative. So if you're wondering whether stepping back makes a difference, understand this: absence doesn't create feelings. It reveals them. And the reflection I want to leave you with is simple but powerful. When you stop trying to be understood, you give others the space to finally understand themselves. One of the most underestimated forces in human psychology is the mind's intolerance for unfinished emotional business. We are wired to seek resolution. When something meaningful ends without clarity, the brain doesn't file it away. It keeps it active. And for an avoidant, unresolved connection is not just uncomfortable, it's destabilizing. Avoidants depend on clean emotional narratives, clear beginnings, controlled middles, and emotionally distant endings. What they struggle with is ambiguity. When a connection doesn't conclude on their terms, when there's no dramatic fight, no emotional explosion, no clear justification for withdrawal, their usual coping strategies fail. There's nothing concrete to point to, no story they can tell themselves to neutralize the emotional weight. So the mind takes over. This is where fixation begins, not because they want to obsess, but because the psyche demands integration. The mind keeps returning to the same emotional territory, searching for meaning, coherence, and closure. It replays conversations. It revisits moments that once felt insignificant and reevaluates them through a new emotional lens. The past becomes more vivid precisely because it was never resolved. And here's the paradox. The avoidant may have initiated distance, but they don't experience closure from it. Distance creates space, but it doesn't create understanding. In fact, it often creates the opposite. Without active engagement, the mind is free to speculate, and speculation magnifies emotional significance. This is why avoidants often think about someone more after the connection fades than when it was alive. Presence allowed them to regulate. Absence removes that regulation. Without interaction to anchor their interpretation, they are left alone with unanswered questions. Why does this still matter? Why does it feel unfinished? Why can't I move on the way I expected to? Philosophically, this reflects a deeper truth about human consciousness. Meaning doesn't dissolve just because we stop engaging with it. Meaning demands reckoning. And when reckoning is avoided, meaning becomes intrusive. The thoughts return not to torture, but to teach, to force awareness where denial once existed. This mental looping isn't dramatic on the surface. It often shows up as distraction, irritability, or restlessness. The avoidant may not label it as missing you. They may call it stress, boredom, or confusion. But underneath those labels is a fixation on what was left unresolved. The mind keeps circling because it hasn't found a place to land. What intensifies this loop is emotional silence. When there's no contact, no feedback, no confirmation of how you feel, the imagination fills the gaps. And imagination is rarely kind. It amplifies uncertainty. It turns ambiguity into significance. The avoidant begins to wonder not just about you, but about themselves. Why did this affect me? Why can't I let this go? What does this say about my ability to connect? This is the stage where internal conflict peaks. Part of them NTS relief through closure. Another part resists reopening emotional doors. And so the mind stays stuck between wanting resolution and fearing exposure. That tension keeps the loop alive. This is also where your behavior matters most. If you rush in to offer clarity, reassurance, or emotional explanations, you collapse the loop prematurely. You give their mind an answer before it has reached its own understanding. But when you allow the ambiguity to remain, the mind is forced to confront the deeper question, not what happened between us, but why did this matter to me in the first place? That question is transformative, because once an avoidant recognizes that emotional significance existed, denial becomes impossible. The loop doesn't break through distraction. It breaks through insight, through the realization that avoidance didn't protect them from attachment. It only delayed awareness of it. So if you're wondering whether being unresolved has power, understand this. The mind fixates not on what is lost, but on what is incomplete. And here's the thought I want to leave you with. Closure isn't something you give to someone else. It's something the mind creates when it finally stops running from the truth. There's a moment in every avoidant cycle when distance stops doing what it was designed to do. At first, emotional withdrawal feels like relief. The nervous system calms. The pressure eases. The avoidant regains a sense of control, but suppression is not resolution, it's postponement. And postponed emotion doesn't stay dormant. It reorganizes beneath the surface, gathering force. Coldness, in this sense, is not the end of connection. It's the last line of defense, before emotional collapse. Avoidants rely on emotional distance as a primary coping mechanism. It works until it doesn't. Over time, the very strategy that once protected them begins to fail because the emotions it suppresses continue to exist. Feelings don't dissolve when ignored, they compress. And compression creates intensity. This is why emotional breakdown and avoidance rarely looks dramatic at first. It doesn't arrive as tears or confessions. It arrives as cracks in the structure, increased irritability, unexpected nostalgia, a restless sense that something is wrong. The mind becomes less efficient at distraction. The body carries tension that doesn't release. The internal narrative they've relied on, I'm fine, I don't need this, I'm better off, starts to lose credibility. What's happening here is psychological fatigue. Suppression requires energy. Constant emotional restraint demands effort, and effort signals that something unsustainable is being maintained. Eventually, the system begins to weaken under its own weight. This is the stage where regret often enters, not as longing, but as recognition. A subtle realization that something meaningful was mishandled. That distance didn't solve the problem, it avoided it, that the sense of control they tried to preserve came at the cost of emotional honesty. And this is where many people misunderstand the avoidance behavior. They expect closure, apologies, emotional accountability. But emotional collapse doesn't follow a script. It follows pressure. And pressure releases in unpredictable ways. Sometimes it shows up as sudden curiosity, a casual check-in, a message that feels oddly neutral but emotionally loaded. Sometimes it shows up as emotional projection, irritation, defensiveness, or blame. And sometimes it shows up as silence that feels heavier than before. These are not contradictions. They are symptoms of an internal system struggling to recalibrate. What's important to understand is that this breakdown is not about you doing something right or wrong. It's about the avoidant reaching the limits of avoidance. When distance no longer regulates emotion, something has to change. Either they deepen avoidance, which becomes increasingly isolating, or they begin to face what they've been suppressing. This is where your role becomes critical. Not as an actor, but as a stabilizing presence. The worst thing you can do at this stage is rush in emotionally, to demand CLA, ready to extract confession. That adds pressure to an already overloaded system. But the most powerful thing you can do is remain grounded, self-contained, emotionally regulated. Your calm becomes contrast. Your lack of urgency becomes safety. Not because you're withholding, but because you're not contributing to chaos. This gives the avoidant space to experience the consequences of their own emotional strategy without being overwhelmed by yours. And here's the philosophical truth beneath all of this. Collapse is not failure. Collapse is information. It reveals what no longer works. It exposes the cost of emotional avoidance. And for many avoidants, this is the first moment where real growth becomes possible. Not because they want it, but because they can no longer avoid it. Whether or not they choose growth is beyond your control. But what is within your control is how you respond to this phase. You can chase collapse, or you can allow it to teach. And the reflection I want to leave you with is this. When emotional distance finally breaks down, it doesn't break toward chaos, it breaks toward truth. And the most powerful position you can take is not to force that truth, but to stand steady while it emerges. When an avoidant starts acting cold, there's a temptation to interpret that behavior as confidence or emotional independence. It can look like control, like they've already moved on while you're still trying to understand what happened. But psychologically, coldness is rarely strength. More often, it's a mask, one designed to hide the experience of losing emotional power. Avoidants equate control with safety. From an early point in their development, they learn that relying on others, needing reassurance, or expressing emotional dependence carried risk, so they adapted by becoming self-contained. Composure became survival. Emotional distance became identity. And vulnerability, real vulnerability, became something to avoid at all costs. So when you enter their life and they begin to care, something destabilizing happens. You introduce unpredictability. You introduce emotional relevance. And relevance threatens control. Because the moment someone matters, that person has influence. They can affect mood, focus, sleep, and self-perception. For an avoidant, that feels like a loss of power over their internal world. Cold behavior is the attempt to reclaim that power. This is why avoidants often become distant right after moments of connection. Not before, after intimacy, after emotional openness, after a sense of closeness forms. It's not the absence of feeling that causes withdrawal, it's the presence of it. The coldness is an effort to reassert dominance over their emotional landscape, to prove to themselves more than anyone else that they are still in control. But here's the contradiction they don't want to face. Acting cold doesn't restore power. It only creates the illusion of it. Internally, something else is happening. The more they suppress emotion, the more it leaks into thought. They may stop expressing care, but they don't stop monitoring. They watch, they notice shifts, they track distance, and they do this because on some level, they are aware that the connection has altered them. That awareness is unsettling. It challenges the narrative they've built about being unaffected. This is why avoidant coldness often comes with rigidity, short responses, delayed replies, a sudden emphasis on logic, independence, or boundaries that weren't previously an issue. These aren't neutral behaviors, they are psychological defenses. They're ways of saying, I am still in control, even as their internal equilibrium is shaken. What's rarely acknowledged is that this kind of control is fragile. It requires constant suppression, constant monitoring, constant effort. And effort is a sign that something is being resisted.